If you are here for cracking original research in B2B writing, you're in the right place. My name is Sarah Griesenbach, founder of the B2B Writing Institute. We're a small organization about 2 years old, and we train writers to create really excellent B2B marketing content. The first time somebody asked me to write a survey, I felt like I was being punked because they came up and said, here's $100 or $200 a question. Can you write us a 10-question survey that we'll send out, and then you'll write a report on it? And I was in absolute heaven because it felt like I just got to write test questions and then think about really interesting things and then write about really interesting things. I kept waiting for the catch, but it's since become my favorite project to do. And every year in the Content Marketing Institute B2B marketing benchmarks report, it's in like the top 5 of best lead generation tools people use. So I think that's why it's really important. More of us get into it, more of us learn how to do it, and just write really good content that's a conversation starter for brands that they could do with their audience. So today we have 4 people who are actually practicing original research. These are the people who, if you Google original research and try to hire somebody, they're going to pop up and you're going to hire them. And I love that even though they have really good ideas, wrong song. Even though they have really good ideas, they're out there doing the work. So they really understand how to put together a survey, how to ask the right questions, and then how to report on that stuff. I am so excited to present Kim Gusta, who's going to come with us with creating those findings and then distributing that research around the world, also known as the internet. But Kim is another one of the thought leaders here who is doing this every day in and day out. So I think her experience of really taking ideas, helping clients pull out those pieces and those threads and all the experience she has in that is going to make this really exciting. Kim, thank you so much for joining us.
All right, now you can hear me, right?
Totally. Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and thanks for asking me to come and talk about this. This is a topic near and dear to my heart because I am a writer, and I've expanded into original research over the past, and it's been so much fun. So I'm really happy to talk about this to the audience and hopefully answer some questions for you and give you some information that's really useful that you can use in your own businesses. So we're going to talk about how do you take the research and create an ebook with it, which is one of the things I do almost every time I'm doing a research project with a client, and then how to amplify it or morph it into different content formats. And a lot of the other speakers have talked about this, that there's so many ways to use the research, and we'll get into that a little bit more specifically. This is probably obvious, but why do clients want research ebooks? They need some method for distributing the results, right? And ebooks, when they're written well, should be really easy to consume. One of the things my clients really like to have in the ebook is not only the writing that I do and the organization that I bring to organizing the information in the ebook, but visuals are so important too. They want something that people can skim and scan, and I think that's really important. So one of the things I'll talk about a little bit later is partnering with a graphic designer who's going to lay out the ebook, because I think that's really important. You've got to look at both sides of it, both the visual aspect and the written aspect. And then lastly, one of the most important things with the research ebook is it needs to fulfill your client's marketing objectives. And I think Michelle mentioned this. You've got to find out what that is before you even start the project. Do they want to generate leads? Do they want media mentions? Do they want to drive thought leadership? And a lot of times these things overlap, but it is really important to dig down and say, what are your top 2? And I will say, I think every time drive thought leadership has always been the most important thing, back to Matt's presentation. And then usually the second thing is driving leads. So it's interesting. You can see different clients might have different objectives, but based off that's going to also drive how you write the ebook, how it gets amplified, and it really drives your strategy. So here's an example of an ebook that I wrote last summer. This is for Comcast Business. And I'll tell you just a little bit about this project. This was actually my first project, I will admit that, and that was last summer. And I have a contact at Comcast Business who I've worked with for years. And she said that she was going to be doing some research and she wanted me to write the ebook. And I said, you know what? I think I can do the research. I want to get into this area. And luckily I had a good enough relationship with her. She trusted me to go off and do this. And I've got to say, preface this, if you want to get into doing original research, talk to Michelle. She has a great training program. I went through that. And if it weren't for her help, I'm not sure that I'd be where I'm at right now today with original research. And she's helped me immensely. So definitely Michelle is your best resource if you want to learn how to do original research step by step. But in this particular study, the woman I worked with was actually responsible for the Western sales region. So her territory covered New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. And so we had a research study, this was during the height of the pandemic, that basically asked IT leaders, how are you doing with remote work? How many people are working remotely right now? Are you doing if you used to do in-person transactions, are you now conducting them remotely? And we went into quite a few different aspects of it. And in the end, we produced 3 eBooks, one for each of the states. So we cut the data in such a way that we could see what was Colorado's research, what was Utah's, and what was New Mexico's. So that was another example of cutting the data. Matt talked about that in different ways. So let's talk about the specifics. I think of this in 3 different ways. And everybody's talked about looking for the story in the data. Wow, that is the most important thing as a writer. And I think that's where we bring a lot of really good skills to projects like this, is we're always thinking about the story, right? And this has got to come in at stage 1. You know, you do not want to be thinking about the story once you've already got the results. You want to think about that story before you even start writing the survey. That is critical. And Michelle talked about this too. I have a lot of questions that I keep in mind. And one of them, before I even start writing the survey, is what's really interesting? You've got to know this audience. And that comes, well, one of the things I do with every one of my clients, especially a new client, is I do a 1-hour kickoff call with them to really understand who do they sell to, what are their solutions, what are the problems they're solving for our client. And that kind of information helps inform questions like this, because my client knows their audience better than I do, but this really helps inform that. So you want to find out you want to think about what's really interesting to this audience. Have the audience in mind. Excuse me. What don't they already know? And this goes back to some of the things Michelle was talking about too. Are there any interesting gaps that you can highlight in the research? Does it confirm or deny any popular assumptions? And here's an example that I like. This is actually what Michelle sent out in her email this morning that she alluded to. This is from a survey, the RPA developer survey from UiPath. And I love the way this data is displayed. First of all, it illustrates the gaps visually so well. The designer who did this was very clever, in my opinion. And they're not just showing you the data, the numbers, they're also wrapping it into a story. So this is just one page from the survey, but you can see the content at the top of the page helps exemplify what the data is actually telling, what the numbers are actually telling. And we're looking at 2 different variables here. We're looking at what different variables are that are important to these software developers, and then how satisfied are they in each of these aspects. And you can see right away what the gaps are. And somebody was clever enough to come up with a survey that asked about these gaps and would illustrate them. So they were thinking about this, I'm sure, right from the very beginning when they created those survey questions. Number 2, please don't just regurgitate numbers. Your client isn't hiring you for that. They're hiring you to look for the story again, and they want you to add value and interpretation to those statistics. Nobody wants to read a scientific report, say written by a college professor. And my apologies to anybody who might be a college professor on the webinar. But you want to make sure that you're adding value with your prose, with what you're writing. So and think about this in multiple ways. Matt alluded to this too. How can you combine different data points to tell the story? How can you do crosstabs? How can you bring in multiple variables and look at how the different data aligns? This is really interesting a lot of times because it'll uncover wonderful data, really juicy data that you really might not have known about otherwise. And remember, you're telling a story. So use the numbers to further the narrative, but don't use them to be the narrative, if you understand the difference between what I'm saying there. So the narrative has to lead, and the numbers are the support to it. So here's another page from the RPA survey that I thought did a nice job with this too. I love how, again, I always try to write for skimming and scanning. This report does a wonderful job of that, I think. The left-hand column in the orange box, they've got a summary of what this data is showing. So if somebody is just running through the report quickly, at the very least, my guess is they're going to read the white text on the left-hand side because it's so prominent. And then in the data itself, the bar charts, you can see, again, they've got explanations. They're not just regurgitating that 42% said definitely there will be more RPA job openings next year. They're interpreting that. They're adding a little bit more value to that data. And then number three, I alluded to this earlier, is really, I think this is actually one of the most important things. And I've learned this over time. It wasn't something I thought about in my very first original research study I did, is how important those visual aspects are. And I think it's our job as writers to really reach out to those graphic designers, because of course their role usually comes after ours. We usually write it, pass it off to a graphic designer. I don't even necessarily see it again sometimes when it's normal ebooks. But I think when it comes down to research ebooks, you really need to take a different role and you need to partner with that graphic designer. My current client I'm doing an original research study with, we actually, the client, myself and the graphic designer, we actually met with their creative director and talked about, okay, how do you want to do this, client? They want a lot of infographic type visuals in this report. They don't want just bar charts and pie charts. So that takes a whole nother level of expertise really on a graphic designer's part too. Not, my experience has been not every graphic designer can do infographics really well. If you're responsible for finding the graphic designer, I would want to see work that they've done in the areas that you want to illustrate in this report. If it's the client who's finding the designer, again, make sure you're really clear on what those visuals should look like. And the other part of this too is as I'm writing, I'm thinking about what those visuals should be. I'm not a graphic designer, so my visuals, even in my head, don't look like what that great graphic designer is going to come up with. But I'm thinking about where are the areas that most lend themselves to some kind of visual design, and especially when it comes to infographics, because those are they're so hot. Sometimes what I'll do with designers too is we'll have the bar charts and the pie charts in the report. Those are given, but we'll try to take at least say 20 to 30% of the data and turn it into more of an infographic format. And one of the things your clients can do with that is they can actually lift that. If the graphic designer lays it out in such a way, they can actually lift that out of the report and then use that in their social media like a standalone infographic. So if you think ahead for these types of things, you can really help your clients out, and they're just absolutely delighted when you give them an infographic or something like that to go ahead and use. And this is an example of, I think, really brilliant visual design. It is so simple and well done. So this is from a Salesforce report, the state of marketing. They do this every year. And this is showing of the people who took the survey, which ones are underperformers, moderate performers, and high performers. It is so obvious right away who's the moderate performers. It's the people in the biggest triangle, the biggest mountain. And I think this is another example of really lovely design because it's so simple. Somebody running through the report quickly or skimming and scanning will know immediately which of these buckets was the biggest. Okay, then let's talk about amplification, amplifying the research content. This is one of my most favorite things about original research is that it can be used in so many different formats. Matt talked about this too. A lot of my clients do webinars after we publish the ebook. And what they'll often do is the webinar will be introducing the results. And we actually may not have released the ebook yet. That's actually what typically happens. And then they'll use the webinar as a follow-up they'll use the ebook as a follow-up to the webinar. So they'll send that out to the people who attended the webinar and those who signed up and didn't attend. Infographics are great, like I talked about. It's so easy to take that data in many different ways and create infographics. And if you can go ahead and put something in that format in the report, the ebook report, that's a great thing for your client to easily pull out. Articles, Matt was talking about PR. This is a great way to get PR and media mentions. That's often one of the big things that my clients want to, are media mentions. So it might involve writing third-party articles, press releases, anything that can help get that content and that interesting data in front of the media. Videos are another thing. A lot of times they'll take a webinar and chunk it up into videos, which is a pretty easy way to get yourself a few different videos. And then lastly, I think this is the one that a lot of clients don't think about, which really makes me sad because they make a big investment in original research. And I have clients who've actually not really done much else with it. So one of the things I do with them is we create a content plan together. And my real impetus behind that is to help them get the most ROI out of the study. And secondarily, for me to have to have other work to do with them. There is that part of it too. So the other ebooks, what I wanted to talk about here is you probably have a main theme that you're using for that first ebook that you wrote, but there are always more that can be created. And for instance, in the Comcast survey, we asked them a lot about remote work at the time during the pandemic. That alone could have been easily an ebook all by itself. We also asked them about contactless transactions. I could have easily written another ebook on that. And maybe it wouldn't be quite as long as the first one. I've also written what I call mini ebooks. They're maybe 4 pages long instead of 10 pages long. But there's so many different ways, if you're creative, that you can cut up that content and reuse it. And your clients will love you for recommending these different ways to do that. So here's a chart that I created, and I have to give Michelle credit for this because she shows you actually her version of this, and then I took it and expanded it a little bit, because she was the impetus for creating this. I call this my 9x14 grid, and along the left-hand side are different ways that you can use original research. So white papers, ebooks, videos, blog posts. And then along the top are different marketing strategies that your clients might have for that they might want to fulfill with original research. So we talked about lead generation, nurturing leads. They might want to launch a new product or service. They might want to reposition their company or generate media attention. And the orange dots are those intersections. So you can see ebooks right off the top. In my opinion, somebody else might put their orange dots in a different place in their chart, but ebooks fulfill all those. They fulfill all those different strategies. And this has been a wonderful chart to give clients because, again, I want to see them create as much content as possible from this research. However many different iterations we can go through. So they're busy. They don't always think about the fact that, oh, we could have created a SlideShare presentation from that. We've got pillar pages on our website, blog posts. Everybody tends to think of blog posts, but do they think about social media posts with influencer and data quotes? Not so much. So that's where you can play the role of the expert and really help them think about all the different ways to take this content and amplify it. And if you'd like a copy of this, it's on my website, not gated, totally free. Please feel free to download it. You can give it to your clients. I just ask to keep the copyright information at the bottom, but it's a wonderful conversation starter with clients. And here's my contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I love having dialogues with other writers, especially about original research. And if there's anything I can do for you, just let me know.
Oh, cool. Thank you. So if anybody has questions for Kim, stick those in the chat, but I've got my list to start with. So I'm really curious when it comes to creating findings. Let me think of a gentle way to say this. Sometimes marketers want to talk about their product and things that relate to their product and really build the story around selling, which makes sense because that's why we're all here. We're trying to educate, build awareness, and do the product thing. How do you maybe coach or handle or guide clients into really focusing on the story and creating findings that are more about, it almost feels like the pursuit of knowledge and interesting ideas rather than just bringing it back to the product all the time? Do you have any kind of approaches you use for that?
Yeah, luckily my original research clients already realized that, so they've actually been really good about not trying to stick their products in there. But I have that happen fairly often when I'm writing ebooks for people, even if they aren't based on original research. You know, I'll say it depends on their goals. Some of them, it makes sense to stick the product in there because of the goal that they've got. Maybe it's a further down the funnel type piece, and they really want to talk about their product and how it works. But a lot of times ebooks are more top of funnel type pieces, and that's really about building awareness. And in that case, we don't talk about the products. And that's what I really try to educate the clients on is, let's think about this from your prospect standpoint. If this is the first time they've heard of you, they're just becoming aware of the category that you operate in. And I write for tech. It's always a tech category. They don't necessarily want to hear about your product right yet. It's a little too early, but we can get into that when we write other content pieces that'll follow along after this one. That tends to be pretty effective when they understand it from that point of view.
Yeah, I like it. And it's true. Yeah, I think bringing it back to the customer and what the customer would actually want to read, especially at the executive level, is that
Mhm.
reminder that we need to keep it non-promotional.
Right.
Nice. And I wonder when it comes to creating findings, I think a theme throughout all of the conversation today is being able to know who you're surveying and asking questions based on that knowledge of the customer. Do you have any thoughts on how to get to know the customers in your niche a little better? Or it's almost like it feels like we're all reinforcing that you really need to niche to write really good original research because then you're asking the right questions. What role do you think that plays in it?
Yeah, I think that's true. And when you say customers, do you mean, Sarah, the recipients of the survey, those who would take it?
Correct. Yeah, because you
Okay.
wouldn't want to ask somebody in the robotics process automation, like there are stupid questions that you could ask for that audience. So you'd want to
Yeah.
know a bit more about them so that you're not wasting their time with a
Right. Yeah,
survey
I
questions.
do. So I do that 1 hour kickoff call with my clients to go through the whole purpose of it isn't to talk about original research. It's to talk about who's your audience. And
I love
I
that.
used to work in tech and my background is in product marketing. And that's exactly what a really good product marketer does is they want to understand their audience inside and out before they do anything. And then the second call I have with them is actually about the original research. So that's huge. And I have them send me any background information they have on our audience so that I've got a good idea.
Ooh,
But
I like.
then, yeah, and then, but ultimately it does boil down to the client too. Once we've got the survey questions written, I need them to look at them and say, is this in the prospect? Is this in our recipient audience's language? Are they going to understand what we're talking about? Do we need to define some terms here? And there are times I'll definitely ask them that as I'm writing survey questions too, because I'll think, I'm not so sure that this is a question that'll really be understood, or maybe it's not relevant to this particular audience. So there's a lot of back and forth that happens like that with the client and myself to make sure that we've got an on target type survey.
Yeah, I love that because the I've often been really surprised that some marketers can go a long time without getting in touch with their customer or ever overhearing a call recorded by Gong or even reaching out to their customers. So the idea that as the writer, you can come in and spark that interest and encourage them to give you that data and have updated customer personas or whatever they're using. It's just all it almost is like original research elevates all of their marketing because it requires you to have those strings and to pull on those threads through everything.
Yeah, that's true. And I'll say too, it helps build a lot of credibility with the clients. We do something like that 1 hour kickoff call that I was talking about for their market overview. I've always waited for one of them to say to me, why do you ask me all these questions? Nobody ever does because
Right.
they really see the value in it. And they say, I think they're really thinking, hey, this is great because she can use this information now to build a really good survey for us or to write content for us that's where she can put herself in the prospect's shoes, the reader's shoes. So it's really
Yeah.
helpful. One other point to what you just mentioned too, Sarah, is that when we're doing these types of surveys, we always do a test. So after the survey is put together, especially if you're using a panel company, it doesn't have to be just with a panel company, but we always send out a small test. We send the survey to a small amount, maybe 10% of the total respondents we want to get, and make sure that the data is coming back in a way that you
Nice.
expect. Because sometimes maybe you did word a question in a way that's really confusing, and now you're getting a whole lot of not sure's as the answer to that particular question. You know,
Right.
that's just another way to bring it full circle to make sure that your survey, everybody's perceiving it in the way that you intended for them to.
Yeah. Or I've seen recently for some reason when you have the option to fill in an other and then people fill in what was already one of the options. So it's like you have to retab the data at the end because they used the fill in and it wasn't marked in the percentages. So like catching that early would have been really helpful.
Maybe you've got errors in the programming or just all sorts of things you want to be catching before it goes out to your wider
Right.
group. So that's one way to do that.
I've seen redundant questions go out. So it's almost like the same question was asked twice and then the results are different. So it's
Right.
like, oh no, what do we use? So
Yeah.
all of that
Yeah.
would have been solved by testing.
It would have been solved by testing. Yep. And we use internal testers and external testers too. I should mention that before we send it out to some of the respondents. People who have written, or people who actually do original research is who I usually ask, and I ask for their feedback on the survey. And that's my first level of feedback, update it, and then we send it out to some of the people who are actual respondents, say 10% of the people that we are, of the total that we actually want to poll. Yeah. So those two levels, by the time you're done with that, you're probably in pretty good shape.
Totally. I wonder if I could ask just one more question, because especially for writers who are about to try this for the first time, and maybe they have a client, they've worked with a couple blog posts, they've done a white paper, it's going really well, they're going to go pitch original research. Can you speak just really briefly to what that timeline is like, or what that process is like for you? Maybe even in comparison to a white paper. Does this just add a couple weeks with gathering data, or how do you see those working together?
Yeah, the timeline is a really important one. I mean, I allow 3 months actually for this. And I know that sounds, oh my God, that's so long. But by the time you get into it, it really is, because creating the survey questions will take way longer than you think. It will take you at least 2 weeks. And that's if your client is really good about responding and getting back to you and thinking through everything. And that includes brainstorming meetings too, to figure out even what they want to ask to begin with. Then there's the programming stage. So that takes a little bit to program it, unless if you're doing it yourself, you're going to have to learn how one of the survey programming tools works. Otherwise, you can outsource it. There's that possibility. Then you've got testing. You go through the 2 testing phases I just talked about. You have some people who tested, and then have, whether you're having a panel company or using internal folks or an internal list for your survey, do a small sample test. And then normally in the field, it pretty much always, we allow 3 weeks for that to get all the responses back that we're expecting. So right there is almost a month. Right there is, you're getting into a good 6 weeks at that point plus. Then there's the writing the paper and meeting with the client. You got to present your results. I always do an internal presentation to the clients to present the results. And then there's understanding what they want to put into the ebook, writing it. And then in this case, the project that I'm doing now, we have graphic design built into the timeline too. So we're doing it in 3 months, and I'll tell you, that's actually a little rushed. I know it sounds like crazy long, but accurately that's...
Well, I think that's interesting. I won't go into like the specifics of pricing, but I think that is part of the process freelance writers should understand, is when you're moving into really higher priced engagements, it's also because it takes longer. Like, it's not a blog post that you do an interview, kind of turn around in a month, and you can fit 10 at a time and make that scale work for you. When you commit, especially to a longer project, I imagine you might only be balancing like 2 or 3 of these that overlap a little bit. And so that's why it becomes this higher paid project. And it's a beautiful thing if you love this kind of work.
Yeah, I totally agree. And until you get these really under your belt, I wouldn't advise doing 2 at once. There's just a lot of moving parts, and every one is a little bit different. And there are the same stages that I just talked about. It is a lot of work. It really is. I enjoy it, so I don't mind it. But be sure you like your client, because you're going to be working with them for a while too.
Right. And you're going to have to disagree on some things. Like, they'll push back, you'll push back. And with truly last question, I could ask all day, but with the question brainstorming, do you use any tools or mind maps for that? Or are you a Google Docs, Word doc?
So what I use is I have a set of questions I go through. I built on some that Michelle had, and which work really well. And then what I do, this is a new thing that I've just started doing, is I always send them questions in advance, so that if they look at them, great. If they don't look at them, that's totally fine too. We're going to go through them anyway. And I open up a Word document and I share it with them. And as they give me the answers, I type them in. And that sounds super simple, but actually it works great, because everybody is on the same page. They can correct me if I just type something incorrectly or I interpreted it incorrectly. And when I go back, what I used to do, I still record calls and I used to transcribe them, but it took me so long to go through the transcript. It was actually not really worth the time. This works so much better. I've got everything right there. It's in their words. They've already seen it, especially if you've got a group of people who you're doing the brainstorming with. I find that really helpful, to type everything into the shared document. Of course, you got to be a fast typist, but that works out okay.
I think most of us are.
I have to say that is the most valuable thing I've started doing recently, is having that shared document as we do the discussion.
Very cool. And I do something similar, but I don't share it with other people. So I've never considered that before. But since I'm usually doing like a 7 to 10 question survey, which is much shorter, I create a graph with 3 columns. And on the left side, as I'm interviewing the client, I'll try to figure out the 7 themes that we really want to cover. And then I'll start working on what are the questions that are going to hit each of those themes with the answer sets. And then I have an example of what kind of data they might be able to draw from that if we went live with the survey question. So I'm doing that privately, and then I send them the questions as a first draft, and then they can pick that apart and send it back. So it sounds like there's a lot of ways to do this with really good results.
Yeah, and I do that with the survey. Once I get the rough draft of the survey done, I do that too. We have a meeting, I pull it up as a shared document, and we just have at it. Yeah. So great way to do it with a bunch of people too.
Great way to herd the cats.
Yes.
Idea cats. Kim, thank you so much for opening, the curtain and showing us how you do this. That's been really helpful. And I love the mix of marketer side, writer side, data side, writing side. I feel like we really gave people a good introduction to all of this. Thank you for sticking with us, this presentation on original research. And like I said, I hope this either gives you insight into how to make your process better or confidence to pursue this as an original research project, because this is a really great way you can become a partner to your client, not just the writer monkey who takes the assignment and does it and then runs away, but to be someone that they go to as a resource to actually fulfill lead generation, SEO, attention, ideas, thought leadership. It is a jargon word, but it also is really meaningful for companies that are trying to invest in it. And writing, it's just how thought leadership comes out there. A webinar starts with an outline, a podcast starts with interview notes, like words are how this is happening. So if you can get in there and be the smartest person in the room, like Matt said, I'm going to be thinking about that quote all day. If you can be that smart person that they want on their marketing team, that's how you build a really successful business that has a lot of recurring business to it. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month.